don't know if you've heard, unless you regularly tune into my broadcast, in which case you definitely did, but if rumors are to be believed, then we are on the verge of getting a brand new Superman movie. The first solo adventure for this character since Man of Steel all the way back in 2013. A simpler time to be sure, but one lacking in Nathan Fillion rocking that Guy Gardner signature bowl cut, which is a world I refuse to go back to. So until the thing releases, which I guess is tomorrow, I will be continuing this 3 discussion streak talking about the Man of Steel because I'm just so gosh darn excited. Also, my producer tells me that doing so is pretty good for the algorithm.
Yes.
I wonder how many of you actually believe that I have a producer and I'm not just talking about the lamp with a burned out light bulb that's been sitting in my corner for the last year and a half. Believe what you will, and while you do that, I will be continuing to spout my excitement for James Gunn's first steps into a DC universe of his own design. But while I'm thrilled that we'll be seeing his take on Superman in not too long of time, I have to admit, this is something of a gamble. Because despite being the top 3 most popular superheroes of all time, Superman, the movie that is taking a huge risk. Because if we're to believe every rumor the internet churns out, the reports are saying that this movie, including marketing and all, is going to cost Warner Brothers something like $500 million. Jeez, imagine all the things you could do with that kind of cash. Actually, don't think about all that unless you're ready to learn just how evil those fat cats funding these things really are. But instead of dwelling on the harsh reality that most, if not all, billionaires would probably turn you and me into mulch if it improved their bottom line, let's instead talk about why this film is taking such a big risk. Why is Warner Brothers betting the house on James Gunn's Superman? And what do I think will happen if this film succeeds, or if it does, the other thing? So let's discuss. I know, another superhero discussion, but bear with me, alright? It's not my fault Marvel and DC both decided to drop films with their flagship characters within weeks of each other. It's just how things ended up working out. So 'tis the season for superheroes, because we're going to be talking about them a lot this month. Also, I might have just alluded to what I'm going to be discussing next week.
Sometimes foreshadowing is relatively obvious.
But don't worry, after that, I've got a lot of other things I want to discuss. Like, any of you guys see K-pop Demon Hunters? I'm getting off topic. Anyway, Superman. You all know by now, but this is a movie that I've been keeping a close eye on. Having done a number of discussions about the character, the cast, and a little bit what we know about the movie going in, I've got high hopes for this one. I haven't discussed much about what I think the story of this movie is going to be, because I'm not really much of a theory crafter, since I prefer to let the storytellers do their job, rather than constructing an entire narrative in my own head that I spend the runtime hoping that they stick to. But something I am curious about is the goals of this production, as well as those working to get it off the ground. And I'm sure many of you know, James Gunn alongside co-producer Peter Safran aren't just teaming up to make one film, but rather to build the start of something new. With the ever-growing slate of shared cinematic universes in the vein of what the folks down the street at Marvel have been doing for the last 10 plus years, DC has been trying to emulate their competition's success for the better part of that tenure. With their latest attempts being the DCEU, which is basically the same thing as a new one, except they're throwing the letter E in there. The DCEU was to be Warner Brothers' answer to the challenge the folks over at Marvel had proposed. Initially kickstarted with Zack Snyder's Man of Steel, alongside Geoff Johns and Jon Berg, tasked with overseeing the franchise and maintaining cohesive storytelling along with providing a degree of creative input. Eventually, these two would be replaced by Walter Hamada in 2018, after the failure of 2017's Justice League. Many claim DC kind of rushed into their cinematic universe, forcing all of their characters together before they had time to resonate with audiences, which I can see. However, if you can believe it, Marvel actually had the exact same amount of time between starting their universe and teaming up all their characters. Yes, Iron Man 1 was released in 2008, and the Avengers came together in 2012. Meanwhile, DC started in 2013 and brought its coalition together 4 years later in 2017. But, like I always say, it's not about how long you last, but rather, what you do with the time that counts. Unfortunately, like me, DC did not use the time it had well and ended up rushing to an underwhelming climax that satisfied no one. From here, the franchise would limp along until it was finally put out of its misery in 2023 with Aquaman: The Lost Kingdom. And while the franchise did have a few diamonds in the rough, what it had in standouts, it lacked in overall cohesion, resulting in the need for new management to be brought in order to clean the slate and start from a fresh beginning, which in my opinion is the best outcome. Because now we get to see a fresh new team take a crack at the poster boy for superheroes. But I've already talked about the work going into making this story a reality, as well as the team that James Gunn and the folks over at DC have put together, along with the resumes of many of the big players involved. But still, despite all the reasons I have to look forward to this film, there are still a few lingering concerns I can see many gearing up for. Fears like an overstuffed, nonsensical plot, too many characters taken away from the main stars of the show, as well as the possibility that James Gunn's sensibilities as a filmmaker might not be suited to the more genuine authenticity that Superman typically necessitates. The trailers have been stuffed full of characters and implications of a grander universe, resulting in the worry that this movie might be putting the cart before the horse when it comes to universe building. But again, with many of this director's prior work, I've never seen this be much of an issue, and he's normally able to balance the story that he's telling in the moment as well as the greater machinations of the world it takes place in. But there are so many ways that this could play out, and to simplify things, I've narrowed them down to 4 main possibilities I can see coming to fruition. Scenario 1, I can see the movie coming out and being loved by critics. An absolute gem of a film, as well as doing gangbusters at the box office. This would be the best outcome. Option number 2 is this film could come out and be terrible despite so much evidence to the contrary, and result in a complete box office bomb. This is not the best case scenario. Some might say it's even the worst. But there's also 2 other outcomes I can see coming to pass. It could come out and be as terrible as people fear, but still do well at the box office. This would be one of the middle case scenario. And the counter to this would be it comes out, is a phenomenal film, but its critical success doesn't mirror its showings at the box office. Also not one of the better ways this could turn out. Now there's also the possibility this film comes out and it's somewhere in between all these, you know, like a mid-movie that does okay. But this is the internet we're living on, and therefore we're always dealing in extremes and absolutes, because that's just kind of the way things work around here. So let's look at what would happen if any of these 4 outcomes transpire. Starting with the worst case first, it's terrible and bombs. So first, I'm going to debunk the theory that if this film sucks and is a giant bomb at the box office, then it will in some way result in Warner Brothers completely canceling the future DC projects. Because, realistically, this just won't happen. Especially with the ones that are in production right now. I know Warner Brothers isn't completely opposed to the idea of shelving a project that's basically completely finished. Rest in storage, Batgirl. But my understanding is that this was a hyper-specific tax loophole that only would apply to a handful of films. During the time that Warner Bros. Had merged with AT&T and then been sold off, only then to be acquired by Discovery in 2022, this project had shifted so many hands that many of the people involved were no longer part of the company, allowing them to write off the film under the condition that it never sees the light of day. This also applied with a never-to-be-released Scooby-Doo movie and Coyote vs. Acme. But this company-wide shakeup hasn't happened since 2022, which is also the same year that James Gunn and Peter Safran took control of DC, meaning that the projects they have in the works would most likely not meet the parameters for the same tax loophole. Basically, everything at DC right now is under Gunn and Safran's supervision, even the Batman, despite neither of them having that much of a creative hand in it. So unless there is some kind of a loophole that I don't know about, which is possible, I mean, the clown college I went to only taught us how to reform after getting popped and not like law and stuff. But I doubt one film failing, even one as large as something like Superman, would result in any full-scale stop on any projects. I do, however, foresee a consequence of this film's potential failure being a massive scaling back of side stories and spin-offs being told, and forcing the creative team to take things back to basics, meaning anything not already in motion would be brought to a stop. Gunn would also probably want to recenter himself and take a greater degree of time to make sure the stories that he was telling both resonate with him and the audience that he's trying to reach. But I still think this is a very unlikely outcome, mostly due to the fact that moving forward with a project without a completed script is something that James Gunn specifically said that he is trying not to do. Maybe he was lying, but even if this film turns out to be utter crap, that doesn't mean that the script wasn't complete. It could have also just not been any good. So we really won't know if he sticks to this motto unless we hear reports coming out from the other projects claiming that they are not sticking to this mandate. But this is all assuming that it's bad. However, what if it's actually good and still doesn't make any money? Unfortunately, this in my opinion is much more likely to happen. Earlier this year, a similar fate befell a movie called Thunderbolts. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's one I rather liked. Sadly, despite being, in my opinion, the best thing to come out of Marvel in years that wasn't animated, it didn't manage to find the audience that it needed in time to be considered a box office success. The movie came and went as though no one knew it was ever there. Except me and a handful of dedicated fans, of course. And the reason for this failure comes down to a number of different factors. The first and most obvious being that Marvel isn't exactly batting 1,000 anymore. Some argue that they never did, but now it's no longer a question. So the good name that they cultivated for superhero movies has kinda lost its shine. And with the movie before coming out being Captain America: Brave New World, a film that notably didn't feel brave, new, or like any world I've ever seen, people were not necessarily hyped to see another installment in this universe. But how does this affect Superman? Well, even though both you and me can't explain the difference between Marvel and DC Comics, that's not necessarily the case with general moviegoers. Many assume that all superheroes are pretty much the same thing. Some folks have a better idea than others, but not to the extent that this is the case with the entire audience that this film needs to reach. As I stated, nearly $500 million is being funneled into this Ponzi scheme of a movie. So they pretty much need to get the entire population of the US to see it just to break even. And that includes folks who couldn't tell the difference between Superman and the Century. And if films with Caped Crusaders in them are no longer what people want to see, then what hope does Superman have that Thunderbolts didn't? Well, for starters, name recognition. You see, Thunderbolts, as good as it was, didn't star any heroes mainstream audiences would recognize. Furthermore, it also didn't advertise itself like a typical Marvel movie, having a much darker and more mysterious presence that made it feel less like a tentpole blockbuster and more like something that would come out of A24. Superman, on the other hand, is bright, bold, and filled with recognizable elements from the mythos. So despite superhero movies not being the juggernauts that they once were, Superman is still something of a household name, and as a result would ensure a better turnout than any film where the most recognizable character is Captain America's ex-sidekick. That being said, if Superman was beloved and still bombed, I do think things would continue business as usual at DC, though my biggest fear is that the studio would attempt to meddle more with James Gunn's creative control, making changes and decisions without his approval. I know DC is technically its own company that Gunn has full creative control over, but let's see how well those guarantees hold up once the money starts hemorrhaging. Safe to say, I'm not confident that if this movie doesn't do well, we won't see a repeat of the tomfoolery that went down with the last universe. And if the creative storytelling that was demonstrated in the last go-around is a bar that Gunn and company can't even meet, then studio meddling is the least of our worries. But this is the dark timeline, one where capitalism reigns above everything else. Oh wait, that's also the quote-unquote good timeline we're talking about. But let's look at the possibilities that a decent financial performance may bring. As I stated, this film could either do well regardless of the quality of the story. Superman is a household name, and the marketing budget is through the roof. Oftentimes, the studio will tack on an additional third or even half of the original production budget into marketing. But with Superman, they've gone and doubled the thing. Hence why we're seeing nearly a $500 million price tag on this movie. So odds are, if anything, people will go see it, if for no other reason than name recognition alone. So let's say this happens. What would be the outcome if this movie turned a hefty profit, but the story wasn't quite all there? Well, first off, if the film does review poorly, I do expect a sharp drop-off in ticket sales come the next couple of weeks. Especially if that other superhero movie coming out this month is so good that it sucks all the oxygen out of the room. But even still, the movie will probably do well enough to guarantee more to come. Furthermore, despite the potential lackluster story, the team won't change very much. Though I do think Gunn will take the reviews personally and make an effort to correct any future blunders. Looking at his track record, a lot of the complaints that he gets from work he either creates or is grandfathered into are the points that he focuses on in follow-up installments. Plenty claim that Guardians of the Galaxy's biggest flaw was its lackluster villain, and in response, his next 2 installments would bring us some of the best adversaries in the MCU. Meanwhile, the Suicide Squad was maligned for a number of reasons, but one of the main ones was that the crew felt too invincible. After Slipknot, only one other member of the squad kicked the bucket, when there was plenty of opportunities to whittle down this cast. So once Gunn got control of the script, his film would open with an entire team being decimated, and follow the remaining squad members on a mission to cover up state secrets for Amanda Waller. Hell, even the new DCU is taking criticism levied at the last universe, specifically in that many complained that what came prior was too dark and gloomy, and as such, Gunn has taken the liberty of brightening everything up and being more comic book accurate with the colors, costumes, along with a heavy focus on hope and joy a character like Superman brings. Gunn is consistently listening to criticism, even when it's not directly towards a project he himself was attached to. So I have a feeling that even if this movie sucks, he will take inventory of what worked and what didn't. And since the higher-ups only care about the bottom line, so long as the money needs of the investors are met, then he'll probably have the freedom to do whatever he wants. But finally, let's talk about the outcome that I hope most occurs, and that is that this movie is both good and shatters box office records. Well, if this happens, then I'll bet you can guess what comes next. DC's back banners are gonna be strewn across every comic book YouTube channel, people will be telling their friends to go out and see this thing, and both shills and haters alike will finally have some common ground to stand on. Okay, maybe not that last part, there will still be people hating on this film regardless of how good or bad it turns out to be, but most importantly for those paving the way for this universe, a massive box office blowout accompanied by critical praise will serve as a mandate telling them to stay the course. Back in 2008, Iron Man was both a critical darling as well as a strong enough hit to warrant them continuing their plan to build up to an Avengers movie. So you can imagine that a similar series of events would follow in the wake of this film's potential success. We'll also see a greater degree of enthusiasm if Gunn and the team prove that they are indeed the right fit to helm this universe. Remember, there's still a lot of holdouts on whether or not the Scooby-Doo director really should be in charge of not just the biggest superhero of all time, but also the entire multiverse that he inhabits. And even though he's proven himself to be a competent cog in the superhero movie-making machine, the question is, can he lead it? That's really what this movie's all about. You know, other than what most movies ought to be about, and that is telling good stories. But that's just my opinion. But those are just some of the outcomes I can foresee happening. And you know that the pressure really is on. DC really needs a win. Sure, on the TV front they've been knocking it out of the park, despite not stepping up to the plate nearly as often as their competition, But hey, quality over quantity, right?
I know, right?
But this is the first film that they'll be releasing since their awful losing streak of Black Adam, Shazam! Fury of the Gods, The Flash, and Aquaman The Lost Kingdom. There was also Blue Beetle somewhere in there, which I admittedly had my fun with, but no one saw it, so it kind of proves the point. The Batman and The Suicide Squad was like 100 years ago, and aside from their work on the small screen, their big screen outings are just not worth bragging about. And if this is going to be the start of something greater, then that's even more pressure. Admittedly, the team they've got tasked helming this project does seem to be aware of the mission, whereas in Man of Steel's case back in 2013, I'm not as sure everyone was on the same page. That movie to me always felt more like Snyder was following the old school of filmmaking, where you just kind of release one and see where it goes from there. No grand ambition to spin off into a bunch of different franchises, especially since it was only 1 year prior the Avengers came out, meaning that while they were making the film, they had no idea whether or not Marvel's grand plan was actually going to succeed. But it did, and then all those Easter eggs that Snyder had cleverly snuck in went from fun blink-and-you-miss-it references to now full plot points in future films. But with this Superman movie, they know the plan going in, and they appear to have listened to a lot of the complaints that came from the last go-around. They're also betting everything that they got that this is going to pay off in the long term. That's why even if this film only does okay, part of me feels like this movie is also an investment designed to garner more goodwill for the franchise going forward, which is something that a lot of movie studios these days could use now more than ever. And DC is at the front of the line in that regard. I can't say for sure what will happen tomorrow or over the weekend. Will it shatter box office records, or will it bomb harder than the Spice Girls' solo careers? All I can say is that these are the possible ways I can see things playing out if certain conditions are met. I can also say that I just finished purchasing my ticket, since I always put these things off to the last minute. But luckily where I live, there's no one around for miles to take up any space at my local cinema. So that's a plus to living in the middle of nowhere. Alright, let's give this movie a shot, and see how things work out. For all we know, we could be witnessing history in the making, and I'll bet none of us have ever felt like we're living through history, right gang? Regardless of if the movie's good or bad, all I can say is that I am extremely excited for the vastly varied opinions that come out from this film, just because different perspectives only make the discussion more interesting.
You know what it says on his cape? MS-13.
Oh, Jesus Christ.